Imagine you are Commander Taijiro Aoki, the seasoned air officer, standing on the flight deck of the flagship Akagi at 10:20 in the morning on June 4th, 1942. For 6 months, your fleet has been invincible. You were at Pearl Harbor. You swept through the Indian Ocean. Every enemy you've met has been brushed aside. Below deck, the planes are being armed for the final decisive blow against the American fleet. You've weathered their pathetic piecemeal countermeasures this morning. You think the worst is over. You are about to be fatally wrong. This is the moment of ultimate triumph. And then, in the next 5 minutes, you will be engulfed in a terrible storm of fire and steel from which there is no escape. You will watch as the most powerful naval force on the planet is utterly defeated. How did it come to this? How did it all go so wrong? To get the sheer shock of Midway for the Japanese, you have to understand the mountain of confidence they were standing on. After the stunning success at Pearl Harbor, the Kido Butai, the First Air Fleet, led by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, went on a 6-month period of great success. They were the tip of the spear, the apex predator of the seas. The force was built around 6 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. These weren't just ships. They were floating airfields crewed by the most experienced naval aviators on the planet. Many were veterans of the long war in China, hardened by years of real combat. Their skill was breathtaking. They could launch over 100 aircraft in less than 10 minutes, a level of efficiency their American counterparts were still struggling to match. After Pearl Harbor, their conquest was relentless. They supported invasions across the Pacific. They defeated Allied naval power at the Battle of the Java Sea. In April 1942, Nagumo led a 5-carrier force into the Indian Ocean, sending to the bottom the British carrier HMS Hermes and 2 heavy cruisers with almost casual ease. They proved that no corner of the new Japanese empire was beyond their reach. This unbroken chain of victories led to a dangerous condition that Japanese officers would later call victory disease. A deep-seated overconfidence started to influence the high command. They believed their pilots were just naturally better, their fighting spirit was invincible, and their plans were flawless. American morale, they figured, had to be compromised. This arrogance wasn't just an attitude. It infected their strategic planning, blinding them to risks and causing them to wave off warnings that should have set off alarm bells. The men of the Kido Butai were the best in the world, and they knew it. They had never lost, and they couldn't imagine they ever would. This supreme confidence followed them on the long voyage to a tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific, an atoll named Midway. The man behind the Midway operation was the brilliant and often reckless Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Despite all the victories, Yamamoto was worried. He had studied in the United States, and he understood its industrial power in a way many of his colleagues didn't. He knew Japan had a very short window to win the war before America's industrial engine roared to life and buried Japan under an avalanche of ships and planes. Pearl Harbor hadn't been a total success. The American aircraft carriers had escaped. As long as they were out there, the US Navy was a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan's empire. The Doolittle raid in April 1942, when American bombers hit Tokyo itself, was a profound humiliation that proved Yamamoto right. The American carriers had to be neutralized. So, Operation MI was born. In Yamamoto's mind, this was it, the decisive battle of the war. The plan was a masterwork of complexity, a perfect trap to lure what was left of the US Pacific Fleet to its fall. The bait was the invasion of Midway Atoll, an American outpost so important that Yamamoto was sure the US Navy would have to sail from Pearl Harbor to defend it. When they did, the full strength of the combined fleet would be waiting to defeat them. The plan was a classic example of Japanese naval doctrine, which loved intricate, multi-part operations. A diversionary force would hit the Aleutian Islands in Alaska to try and draw American ships north. An invasion force would take Midway. And Vice Admiral Nagumo's Kido Butai, with 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would lead the charge, first neutralizing Midway's air defenses, then turning to defeat the American fleet. Trailing hundreds of miles behind them was the main body, with Yamamoto himself on the super battleship Yamato, ready to complete the operation. But this complex plan was built on a foundation of bad assumptions and pure arrogance. First, it depended entirely on surprise. The Japanese were convinced their codes were secure and their intentions were a secret. They were fatally wrong. American codebreakers in Hawaii had largely broken the main Japanese naval code, JN-25. They knew the target was Midway, a fact they cleverly confirmed by having the base send a fake message about a water shortage, which Japanese intelligence promptly picked up. The Americans knew when the attack was coming and who was coming with it. As the Japanese fleet sailed in radio silence, thinking they were invisible, Admiral Chester Nimitz was already moving his own carriers to spring a counter-trap. Second, the plan was just too complicated. Everything depended on the perfect timing of separate fleets spread out over hundreds of miles of ocean, all without communicating. This meant they couldn't support each other. Nagumo's carriers, the most important part of the whole operation, were basically on their own. Third, Japanese intelligence was a serious problem. A planned recon flight over Pearl Harbor was cancelled. A line of submarines meant to spot the American carriers leaving port was put in place too late. The American ships had already sailed past them. So, the Japanese sailed toward Midway, believing the American carriers were still tied up in Pearl Harbor. They also dramatically underestimated American repair crews. They believed the carrier USS Yorktown had been struck, or at least crippled for months, at the Battle of the Coral Sea. In reality, an incredible effort at Pearl Harbor got her patched up and ready to fight. The Americans were bringing 3 carriers to the party, not the 2 Japan expected. Maybe the most telling moment came during the pre-battle war games on the battleship Yamato. The story goes that in one simulation, the officer playing the American side launched a surprise attack that was ruled to have rendered inoperable 2 of Nagumo's carriers. The chief umpire, Rear Admiral Ugaki Matome, simply overruled the call. He put the carriers back on the board, saying such an outcome was unlikely. The flaws in the plan were right there on paper, but they were dismissed by victory disease. The trap was set, but the Japanese didn't realize they were the ones about to walk into it. At 4:30 in the morning on June 4th, 1942, the decks of the Kido Butai roared to life. In a stunning display of efficiency, 108 aircraft were launched in just 7 minutes to strike Midway Island. Their mission: compromise the island's air power to clear the way for the invasion. As they flew off, Admiral Nagumo held half his planes in reserve, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, ready for their real mission: neutralizing any American ships that showed up. Soon, Nagumo's force came under countermeasure. A series of desperate, almost suicidal strikes by Midway-based American planes threw themselves at the Japanese fleet. They were brave, but they were no match for the veteran Japanese fighter pilots. The Zeros tore the American planes apart, and any that got through were met by a solid wall of anti-aircraft fire. Not a single bomb or torpedo hit Nagumo's ships. From the bridge of the flagship Akagi, it looked like another easy victory. Then, at 7 a.m., a message arrived that started to unravel everything. It was from the leader of the Midway strike, Lieutenant Tomonaga. His report was blunt. There is a need for a second attack. The first strike hadn't been enough to knock out the island. This message put Admiral Nagumo in an impossible position. Yamamoto's orders were clear: keep the reserve planes armed and ready for enemy ships. But there was no sign of an American fleet. His own scout planes were reporting nothing but empty ocean. The attacks from Midway, while useless, were an annoying problem. To Nagumo, a cautious commander, the logical move was to deal with the known threat, the island, before worrying about a hypothetical one. At 7:15, he gave the fateful order: rearm the reserve aircraft. The torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs were to be swapped out for land attack bombs. This was no small job. On all 4 carriers, the hangar decks became scenes of controlled chaos as crews wrestled the heavy torpedoes off the planes and wheeled up high-explosive bombs. It was a laborious process that could take over an hour. The decks were now a dangerous jumble of armed planes, bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines. Just as this was happening, the situation changed again. At 7:28, the scout plane from the cruiser Tone, which had launched 30 minutes late, a crucial delay, sent a shocking message. It had spotted 10 enemy ships. A stunned silence fell over the Akagi's bridge. Nagumo immediately shot back a new order. Prepare to carry out attacks on enemy fleet units. Leave torpedoes on those attack planes which have not as yet been changed to bombs. This only made the chaos on the hangar decks worse. Then, at 8:20, came the nail in the coffin. The scout pilot radioed again. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be an aircraft carrier. The hunters had just become the hunted. The real target was here. On the bridge of the Hiryu, the aggressive Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi urged Nagumo to launch attack force immediately. He argued for sending whatever they had, right now, to hit the Americans before they could hit them. But Nagumo hesitated. His by-the-book training took over. Japanese doctrine demanded a fully coordinated strike with fighter escort. To launch now would be to send his bombers in piecemeal, without enough protection. On top of that, his first strike force was returning from Midway, low on fuel and needing to land immediately. His carriers couldn't launch and recover planes at the same time. Nagumo had an impossible choice: launch a weak, hasty attack now, or recover his planes, organize a powerful, coordinated strike, and risk getting hit first. He chose to wait. It was the logical, doctrinal decision. It was also a fatal one. As the Japanese carriers turned into the wind to recover their planes, their flight decks were blocked, and just then, a new wave of American countermeasures began. 3 squadrons of torpedo bombers from the American carriers found the Kido Butai. Flying low and slow in their obsolete TBD Devastator planes, they were severely hit. Of 41 planes, only a handful made it back. They didn't score a single hit, but their sacrifice wasn't in vain. They dragged the Japanese fighter patrol down to sea level, pulling them completely out of position. By 10:20, as the last torpedo attack faded, the decks of the Kido Butai were finally being readied for the counterstrike. On the bridge of the Akagi, there was a sense of relief. They'd weathered the storm. Now, it was their turn. The time was 10:20 a.m. On the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, pilots sat in their cockpits, engines sputtering to life. The ships began turning into the wind, preparing to launch their action on the American fleet. They were at their most vulnerable moment, and they had absolutely no idea. The relentless torpedo attacks had pulled their protective fighter screen down to the waves, leaving the skies above them wide open. Without radar, they were flying blind. At 10:24, a deck officer raised a white flag to signal the launch. As the first Zero fighter roared down the flight deck, a lookout scream cut through the air. "Hell divers!" Out of the sun, from nearly 20,000 feet, 36 American SPD Dauntless dive bombers appeared as if from nowhere. They were from the Enterprise and the Yorktown, arriving completely undetected at the perfect moment. For the men on the decks below, there was no warning, only the terrifying scream of diving planes. The attack was swift and brutally precise. The first bomb slammed into the carrier Kaga. One hit the bridge, resulting in the loss of the captain and his command staff. But the fatal blow was a 1,000-pound bomb that crashed through to the upper hangar, which was packed with fully fueled and armed planes. A chain reaction of secondary detonations erupted, turning the carrier into a raging blaze. At the same time, Soryu was hit by bombers from the Yorktown. 3 bombs struck her. Just like on Kaga, one penetrated to the hangar deck, igniting the waiting planes and fuel. Within 20 minutes, the ship was a lost cause. The flagship Akagi took only one direct hit, but it was enough. The bomb plunged into the upper hangar, right in the middle of the armed torpedo bombers being readied for the strike. The effect was devastating. The tightly packed hangar became a giant fireball. Admiral Nagumo stood in a state of shock, staring at the flames consuming his fleet. His staff practically had to drag him off the burning flagship. In the space of just 5 minutes, the heart of the Kido Butai was ripped out. Three of Japan's finest carriers were burning wrecks. The Japanese obsession with offensive power meant their carriers had poor damage control, and the practice of storing fueled and armed planes in enclosed hangars proved to be a fatal design flaw. But the fight wasn't over. Not quite. One carrier, the Hiryu, commanded by the fiery Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, had been further north and escaped the attack. With the other three carriers burning, Yamaguchi immediately ordered a counterattack. His planes found the American carrier, USS Yorktown, and hit her with 3 bombs. A second strike from Hiryu found the damaged Yorktown again and put 2 torpedoes into her. The Japanese pilots returned believing they'd neutralized 2 separate American carriers. It was a final, defiant act. American scout planes found the lone Japanese carrier. Late that afternoon, dive bombers from the Enterprise found the Hiryu and slammed 4 bombs into her. By the next morning, the last of Nagumo's carriers was gone. The sword of the Imperial Japanese Navy had been damaged. As the sun set on June 4th, the Pacific was lit by the funeral pyres of the Kido Butai. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, plus the heavy cruiser Mikuma, were all going under to the bottom of the sea. But losing the ships was secondary to losing the men. The final toll was staggering. Over 3,000 Japanese officers, sailors, and technicians were lost. Among them were Japan's most experienced, combat-hardened naval aviators and maintenance crews. These weren't just pilots, they were the irreplaceable core of Japan's naval air power, an asset their training programs and industrial base could never replace. The United States, on the other hand, was just getting started. The defeat was so total, so shocking, that the Japanese government went to extraordinary lengths to cover it up. The public was told Midway was a great victory. The survivors were brought back to Japan in secret, quarantined, and forbidden from speaking about what really happened, even to their own families. To hide the truth, the lost ships were even kept on the Navy's official roster for a time, their status shrouded in bureaucratic silence. This culture of denial meant the Imperial Japanese Navy never had an honest reckoning with its failures. The doctrinal flaws, the terrible intelligence, and the rigid planning were never properly addressed, because admitting to them meant admitting the scale of the disaster. Midway was the undisputed turning point of the Pacific War. In one day, Japan's offensive power was compromised, and the strategic initiative was handed to the United States. Never again would the Japanese Navy launch a major offensive. The defeat set the stage for the difficult war of attrition in the Solomon Islands, which began with the American landing on Guadalcanal just 2 months later, a war Japan could not win. The story of Midway from the Japanese side is a harsh lesson. It's a story of how a force at the absolute zenith of its power, blinded by success and convinced of its own invincibility, could author its own downfall. An overly complex plan, a fatal underestimation of the enemy, and a moment of indecision at the worst possible time doomed the finest carrier fleet in the world. The 5 minutes of tension over the Kido Butai on June 4th didn't just cause the loss of 4 ships, they compromised the ambitions of an empire. The Battle of Midway is a timeless lesson in how pride, bad assumptions, and the sheer fog of war can bring even the mightiest to ruin. It's not just a story of ships and planes, but of the human decisions and fatal flaws that sealed an empire's fate. If you found this look at the other side of the story insightful, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. We explore the lesser-known sides of history's biggest turning points every week. Let us know in the comments what you think was the single most critical factor in Japan's defeat. Was it the flawed plan, Nagumo's hesitation, or just bad luck? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching. May 28, 1940, Berlin's Reich Air Ministry. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring tossed aside the intelligence document with open disdain. The report detailed President Roosevelt's request to the US Congress for an unparalleled surge in American aircraft production, a capacity to build 50,000 planes every year. The Americans are desperate if they think such boasting will intimidate us, Göring sneered to his staff. They understand nothing of industrial power. Let them try to convert their car plants. They'll quickly learn that building combat aircraft requires far more than just assembly lines. What Göring completely failed to grasp was that in Detroit, an immigrant from Denmark named William Knudsen was already proving his contempt dangerously wrong. The former General Motors leader, now serving the president for a token $1 per year as the chief of production, was masterminding the most colossal industrial change the world had ever seen. In less than 4 years, American factories would deliver, not the impossible 50,000 aircraft Göring mocked, but nearly 100,000 planes yearly, while simultaneously supplying 2 massive theaters of operation across 2 oceans. The dramatic announcement that sparked the German scorn came on May 16, 1940, as German panzers sliced through France. Before Congress, Franklin Roosevelt declared, "I want to see this nation ready with the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year." The reaction was overwhelming doubt, even from allies. In 1939, America had only produced 3,611 military aircraft. The Army Air Corps flew just 1,700 combat planes, most of them outdated. Yet Roosevelt demanded a 14-fold explosion in production. William Knudsen became the engineering genius behind this industrial wonder. When asked who could possibly achieve such colossal output, presidential advisor Bernard Baruch famously replied, "First, Bill Knudsen. Second, Bill Knudsen. Third, Bill Knudsen." Knudsen gave up his $300,000 salary to serve his adopted country, importing the principles of automotive mass production directly into aircraft manufacturing. The monumental shift started instantly. By December 1941, American factories were building 2,000 military aircraft every month, a 20-fold jump from 2 years prior. The Ford Motor Company revealed plans for an immense heavy bomber facility at Willow Run, Michigan. Boeing drastically expanded its Seattle operations. Douglas Aircraft hired thousands of new workers. The arsenal of democracy was quickly waking up. The Nazi leadership's rejection of American ability came from a toxic mix of racial bias and deliberate blindness. General Friedrich von Boeticher, the military attaché in Washington from 1933 to 1941, sent back accurate reports detailing American industrial preparation. His December 1940 telegram warned, "American military output will reach unimaginable scales." Berlin casually dismissed these essential warnings as the exaggeration of a defeatist. When Boeticher met with Hitler in February 1939 to discuss American capacity, the Führer raved about American racial degeneracy instead of listening to the intelligence. Hitler proclaimed Americans to be half Judaized, half negrified, and incapable of long-term hostilities. This ideological arrogance would prove ultimately disastrous. The prejudice poisoned all levels of command. Luftwaffe intelligence dismissed reports of women joining aircraft factories as sure signs of American desperation. They couldn't fathom that a democratic surge might surpass a totalitarian command economy. When reports showed factories running 3 full shifts, German analysts simply assumed exaggeration. The Nazi worldview just could not accept the reality of America. Ford's Willow Run plant perfectly represented American ambition. Built on farmland starting April 18, 1941, it grew to become the world's largest factory under a single roof, 3.5 million square feet with an assembly line a full mile long. Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief, promised to build 1 B-24 Liberator bomber every hour, when other factories were managing only 1 per day. Initial results were deeply problematic. The first bomber, finished in September 1942, needed total reconstruction. Quality control failures hit 50%. By February 1943, Willow Run was only producing 56 bombers a month against expectations of hundreds. Critics sarcastically named it "Will It Run?" But Ford's engineers persisted, breaking the B-24's 488,193 parts into manageable subassemblies. They invented hydraulic riveting tools, prefabricated wiring harnesses, and continuous moving assembly lines. They incorporated 578 design changes in 1943 alone, while successfully increasing the output. By September 1943, Monthly production hit 148 bombers. By December, it was 365. The pivotal breakthrough arrived in April 1944, when Willow Run produced 428 B-24s, one every 63 minutes, running 24 hours a day. This single facility was now outproducing the entire German aviation industry. German pilots first recognized the American production dominance during the Tunisia campaign. Major Johannes Steinhoff, commanding JG-77, noted in December 1942, "The American pilots are no longer amateurs. Most unsettling, there are more of them every day." This realization accelerated rapidly throughout 1943. January 27th marked the first American airstrike on Germany itself, 64 bombers attacking Wilhelmshaven. By October, during Black Thursday at Schweinfurt, the Americans could suffer the loss of 60 B-17 and easily replace them within 2 weeks. The devastating mathematics of the conflict had become unchangeable. During Big Week, February 20th to 25th, 1944, the 8th and 15th Air Forces launched 3,500 bomber missions against German aircraft production. The Luftwaffe suffered significant equipment losses between 262 and 355 fighters, but more crucially, approximately 100 irreplaceable veteran pilots. General Adolf Galland reported to Göring that Germany was losing 1,200 fighters monthly while only building 1,000. America was building 2,500 fighters monthly while losing only 400. Major Heinz Baer, one of Germany's leading aces with 220 victories, described a January 1944 mission over Brunswick. The bomber stream stretched from horizon to horizon. At least 700 flying fortresses and liberators. We were 8 fighters against hundreds. It was hopeless. By 1944, American aircraft production reached absolutely staggering levels. That year alone, factories produced 96,270 aircraft, 16,048 four-engine bombers, 35,743 fighters, and 22,591 multi-engine aircraft. This output for a single year surpassed Germany's total wartime output of approximately 94,677 aircraft. The gap extended beyond mere numbers. Every American bomber carried 13.50 caliber heavy caliber machine guns with thousands of rounds. German fighters were often launching with partial ammunition loads. American bombers included powered turrets, advanced bomb sights, and complex navigation gear. German fighters frequently lacked functioning radios. Boeing's Seattle Plant 2 was delivering 16 B-17s daily by May 1944. Douglas Aircraft, which had only 68 employees in 1936, had ballooned to 167,000 workers across 9 facilities. North American Aviation was churning out 500 P-51 Mustangs every month. Lockheed was achieving a production rate of 1 P-38 Lightning every 90 minutes while implementing 2,127 combat-driven design changes. Supporting industries mirrored this relentless pace. General Motors built 57,658 aircraft engines under license. Packard constructed 55,523 Rolls-Royce Merlins. Alcoa's aluminum output soared by 600%. Dow Chemical's magnesium production jumped from 6 million pounds annually to 333 million. The transformation of America's workforce completely shattered Nazi expectations. Women, who made up less than 1% of aircraft workers in 1941, represented 65% by 1943, 310,000 women working in the industry. At Douglas Long Beach, 22,389 of 41,629 employees were women. Rosewill Monroe, the original Rosie the Riveter, drove 3,000 rivets per shift at Willow Run with 99.5% accuracy. Female inspectors at Douglas reduced the defect rate from 3.2% to 0.3%. Ford redesigned tools for smaller hands, which unintentionally improved overall efficiency. Lighter pneumatic tools reduced fatigue, and better positioned workstations decreased injuries. German intelligence saw female employment as a sign of desperation. A captured Luftwaffe report dismissed these workers as temporary, predicting a total collapse in quality. Instead, precision dramatically improved. Women excelled at detailed work, wiring, instruments, and inspection. Their inclusion proved to be a sign of democratic strength, not weakness. As American production skyrocketed, Germany withdrew into dangerous fantasy. Göring authorized the Jager program in February 1944, scattering production into 729 underground facilities using forced labor. The Mittelbau-Dora complex employed 60,000 prisoners in terrible conditions, with 20,000 casualties. These underground factories produced more defects than aircraft. Forced laborers actively impeded components. Transportation between the scattered facilities caused extreme delays. Quality control completely collapsed. The entire Mittelwerk complex produced fewer engines monthly than Ford's single Chicago plant. Meanwhile, American innovation accelerated. Boeing developed modular B-29 construction across 4 facilities with perfectly interchangeable parts. The pressurized B-29, costing $65,000 each, incorporated technology Germany couldn't even match in prototypes. By early 1945, America was building 100 B-29s monthly. June 6, 1944, D-Day, marked the spectacular peak of American production. The invasion employed 11,590 Allied aircraft against just 319 German missions, a 36-to-1 superiority. This was not merely a tactical edge, it was industrial triumph. Between January and May 1944, preparatory air operations dropped 145,000 tons on German targets, exceeding the total amount of German air attacks of Britain throughout the entire war. Transport aircraft delivered 3 airborne divisions in a single day, using more planes than Germany's entire transport fleet ever possessed. By December 1944, individual raids involved 1,200 bombers, escorted by 900 fighters. P-51 Mustangs had the range to reach Poland, the performance to challenge any enemy, and existed in such vast numbers that losses became irrelevant. German pilots called them Indians because they were swarming everywhere simultaneously. As defeat became inevitable, even the Nazi leadership conceded the production disaster. In December 1944, Goebbels wrote in his diary, "Göring's promises about Luftwaffe superiority now seem criminal delusions. We are fighting the world's greatest industrial power with mere rhetoric." Rommel told his staff before D-Day, "The Americans can lose 10 tanks for every one we destroy and still overwhelm us. When they land, they will arrive with such material dominance that no position can hold." Even Hitler confessed to Speer in January 1945, "We should have listened to Böttcher's reports." Their industrial potential was decisive. While we built hundreds, they built tens of thousands. Albert Speer later testified that American air operations cut German production by 35% for tanks, 31% for aircraft, and 42% for trucks. He unequivocally stated, "The American attacks, which followed a definite system of assault on industrial targets, caused the breakdown of German armaments." Germany's Me-262 jet fighter, operational in mid-1944, was a genuine innovation, 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter. Hitler and Göring believed this wonder weapon could restore air superiority despite being vastly outnumbered. But Germany only produced 1,430 Me-262s total, with never more than 200 operational simultaneously. The engines needed overhaul every 10 hours. Critical materials were missing, forcing the use of inferior substitutes. America, in contrast, had started jet development in 1942. While the Bell P-59 proved inferior to German jets, Lockheed's P-80 Shooting Star, superior to any German jet, entered production before the war's conclusion. American industrial depth allowed them to simultaneously pursue multiple advanced technologies, a luxury Germany could not afford. The contrast perfectly captured the production war's result. German technological superiority in jets meant nothing against America's ability to manufacture thousands of conventional fighters while simultaneously developing the next generation of aircraft. Quality without quantity was useless in a total conflict. Hermann Göring's detention on May 8, 1945, by elements of the US 36th Infantry Division marked the start of his confrontation with the truth. Initially defensive at the interrogation facility in Augsburg, he insisted that German technology had been superior, only overcome by sheer numbers. His transfer to Camp Ashkan in Luxembourg, the facility for high-ranking Nazi prisoners, brought intense interrogation. In July 1945, Major Kenneth Heckler conducted extensive interviews, documenting Göring's slow and agonizing acceptance of American industrial dominance. "I knew American industrial potential was huge," Göring admitted to Heckler. "But the actual delivery exceeded my worst fears. That single factory at Willow Run produced more aircraft than our entire bomber force at our peak. It was incomprehensible." He was especially astonished by American logistics. "Your ability to supply forces across 2 oceans while maintaining your domestic output. This was beyond our wildest conception. We struggled to adequately supply forces 500 miles from Germany. You supplied armies 5,000 miles from America." During his trial at Nuremberg, prosecutors presented Göring with irrefutable proof of American production superiority. Charts showed America building more aircraft monthly by 1944 than Germany managed annually. Films of Willow Run's assembly lines played as prosecutors listed the German cities damaged by bombers from that single factory. Göring's March 14, 1946, testimony revealed his struggle to understand the scale. "I believed the economic and technical potential of the United States to be exceptionally great, particularly the Air Force. But I never imagined they could increase aircraft production 100-fold in 4 years. Such growth seemed physically impossible." Prison psychologist G.M. Gilbert recorded Göring's obsession with production figures. He constantly recalculated the ratios, comparing single American factories to the entire German output. He seemed particularly fixated on Willow Run, calling it "that powerful factory that broke our backs." When shown that America had produced 812,615 aircraft engines versus Germany's 241,675, Göring simply stared at the figures in silence. The mathematical certainty of the defeat was now inescapable. The sheer scope of this industrial transformation remains stunning even today. From 3,611 military aircraft in 1940, America manufactured 295,959 by the war's end, 97,810 bombers, 99,465 fighters, 98,684 others. This was not just quantity, it was systemic superiority in every aspect of manufacturing. 2 million Americans worked in aircraft production at its peak, including unprecedented diversity: women, African Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, disabled workers, teenagers, and elderly citizens. This democratic mobilization accomplished what totalitarian command could not. Voluntary cooperation far outpaced the output of forced workers by every metric. The workforce that entered factories in 1941, knowing nothing about aircraft, emerged in 1945 as the world's most skilled aviation workers. They didn't just build planes, they revolutionized manufacturing itself. Statistical quality control, first created for bomber production, became standard industrial practice globally. Automation principles pioneered at Willow Run transformed worldwide manufacturing. The engineers who designed the bomber assembly lines would go on to design the Saturn V rocket. The women who riveted B-24s would raise the children who eventually walked on the moon. The production miracle didn't just win the war, it launched the American century. The financial scope defied economic convention. Aircraft production consumed $45 billion in 1940s currency, equivalent to about $800 billion today. The B-29 program alone cost more than the Manhattan Project. Yet, far from ruining America, war production created massive prosperity. Unemployment, which had crippled the Depression decade, vanished completely. personal income doubled between 1940 and 1945. War bond sales by the workers themselves funded much of the expansion. Willow Run workers alone bought $45 million in bonds, effectively financing their own factories' operations. Germany, conversely, dedicated 40% of its entire industrial capacity to aircraft production by 1944, yet still produced less than half the American output. Forced labor, increasingly relied upon, proved disastrously ineffective. Workplace disruption was constant. Quality fell apart. Productivity per German worker actually dropped after 1943, while American productivity surged by 300%. The infrastructure built for war became the foundation for post-war prosperity. Aluminum smelters built for bombers created materials for suburban homes. Chemical plants that made aviation fuel created plastics for consumer goods. Machine tool factories that equipped the aircraft plants retooled American industry for global dominance. Beyond raw production lay organizational excellence. The War Production Board flawlessly coordinated 184,000 companies. IBM punch card machines tracked millions of components across thousands of suppliers. MIT's radiation laboratory, employing 4,000 scientists, developed navigation systems that gave American bombers all-weather capability. When combat showed the B-17's vulnerability to frontal attacks, Boeing added chin turrets within 60 days. When Pacific operations demanded longer range, consolidated modified B-24s without halting production. German modifications took months or years. American improvements took mere weeks. This adaptability proved as crucial as the production volume. American aircraft continuously evolved based on global combat experience. Information flowed from Pacific battles to Atlantic production lines within days. German aircraft, built in isolated underground bunkers by forced workers, remained static, while American designs improved weekly. The feedback loop between combat and production achieved unprecedented speed. Pilots' observations immediately reached engineers. Engineers' solutions reached assembly lines within days. Assembly line workers' suggestions went directly to designers. This democratic flow of information proved superior to the German hierarchical command. On October 15, 1946, just hours before his scheduled execution, Hermann Göring wrote his final message. In it, he made his most complete acknowledgement of the production war's meaning. The Americans won through industrial power, not military skill. We were not defeated by better soldiers, but by better factories. The nation we dismissed as capable only of making consumer goods buried the Wehrmacht under aluminum and steel. His final recorded statement to Gilbert was equally revealing. We declared war on an industrial giant while it slept. When it woke up, we were doomed. They didn't just outproduce us. They revolutionized production itself. Every aspect of their system proved superior to ours. Göring took his own life that night, but his final admission stands as history's verdict on the production war. The Reich Marshal, who had scoffed at American capabilities, died knowing a single American factory had exceeded his entire Air Force's lifetime production. Military historians now see the American production achievement as the decisive factor in the Allied victory. Without the overwhelming material superiority it provided, D-Day would have been impossible, the air operations campaign unsustainable, and the Pacific War unwinnable. Richard Overy, the leading historian of the air conflict, concluded, "The outcome was determined not by fighting spirit or tactical brilliance, but by the weight of material." The Allies won because they buried their enemies under an avalanche of production. The statistics overwhelmingly confirm this. By 1944, America alone was building more military aircraft than the rest of the world combined, Axis and Allied forces. This was not a slight edge, but a magnitude of dominance. Germany faced not defeat, but overwhelming superiority. Yet, the production miracle's importance goes far beyond military triumph. It proved the superiority of democracy over dictatorship, the benefit of freedom over tyranny, and the strength of voluntary cooperation over forced obedience. The workers who achieved this transformation were not forced laborers or conscripts, but free citizens united by a shared purpose. Hermann Göring's scorn for American production capacity is history's most catastrophic miscalculation. His contempt for democratic industrial potential cost Germany the war and millions of lives. His failure to see America's capabilities sealed the Third Reich's destiny before the first bomber even reached German skies. The transformation from 3,000 to 100,000 aircraft annually proved that free societies, when facing an existential threat, could achieve the impossible. American workers did not just meet Roosevelt's impossible goal, they doubled it. They did not just match German production, they exceeded it fivefold while simultaneously fighting in the Pacific. Today's leaders would be wise to remember Göring's mistake. Dismissing democratic nations as weak because they are peaceful, or underestimating the productive capacity of free people because they prioritize prosperity over conquest, only invites catastrophic error. America in 1940 seemed unprepared for war. By 1944, it had become an unstoppable industrial colossus. The arsenal of democracy proved that production lines could be as decisive as front lines, that assembly workers could be as crucial as soldiers, and that industrial mobilization could determine victory as surely as military strategy. Göring learned this lesson far too late, at the cost of his nation's destruction. From his dismissive laugh at Roosevelt's announcement in May 1940 to his execution in October 1946, Hermann Göring's life mirrored the arc of Nazi Germany's destruction. His contempt for American production became the epitaph for the Third Reich, a regime that mistook ideology for ability, confused tyranny for strength, and believed racial mythology could overcome industrial mathematics. The Reich Marshal who scoffed at American aircraft.